When you hear the name Kunta Kinte, what do you picture? A TV miniseries from the 1970s, a symbol of resistance, a whipping scene you half remember from school. Forget all of that for a moment. In the summer of 1767, in Annapolis, Maryland, a real 16-year-old stood on a wooden auction block. The wood was worn smooth by human feet. The grain showed through the stain of weather and time. His wrists were raw from iron. His ankles carried the same scars. The auctioneer described him with one word that would follow him for the rest of his life: rebellious. Plantation owners knew what that meant. Lower price, higher risk, more punishment. On paper he was just another line in a ledger, strong but difficult. In reality, he was a teenager ripped from the Gambia River, only 4 months earlier, about to be sold into a system designed to erase everything he was: his language, his religion, his family, even his name. We know his name, we can trace his sale, we can even see the marks of his resistance in the archives of the very men who bought and beat him. But how did he get from a small Mandinka village to this auction block in Maryland? Who was he before he became a line of property in a book? And what was taken from him before he ever set foot on American soil? This is the part of Kunta Kinte's story that came before Roots, the part that starts far from America, on the banks of the Gambia River. The Gambia River flows through West Africa. It runs east to west, emptying into the Atlantic. In the mid-18th century, the region was home to the Mandinka people. They had established kingdoms and trading networks centuries before European contact. Long before European ships appeared on the horizon, Mandinka farmers, traders, and scholars were debating law, reciting genealogy, telling stories around evening fires. The Mandinka were not a single unified state. They were organized into family groups and village networks. Some leaders had converted to Islam. Others maintained traditional religious practices. There was a cultural complexity that Europeans rarely acknowledged, a world with its own philosophies, its own internal disputes, its own sense of history. According to genealogical research later conducted by Alex Haley, Kunta Kinte was born in the village of Juffure, around 1750. Juffure sat on the north bank of the Gambia River. It was a small settlement, perhaps 200 people. The village was part of a larger network of Mandinka communities, engaged in farming, fishing, and regional trade. Boats came and went along the river. News and goods flowed in and out. The people practiced agriculture based on rice, millet, and other grains. Men cleared land with iron tools. Women planted and harvested, bending over in the flooded rice fields, moving in practiced rhythm. Children tended livestock and learned their roles by watching their elders. The agricultural year followed the rains and the river's moods. This pattern repeated across much of the region. Islam had reached the area through North African traders centuries earlier. Some families had adopted the religion, others had not. There was no sharp line between Muslim and traditional. People lived with multiple belief systems simultaneously. A man might pray in a mosque on Friday, consult a diviner on Saturday, and pour a libation for ancestors on Sunday. According to 20th century oral histories, Kunta's family was Muslim. His father may have been a religious teacher. The details are uncertain, but the basic framework appears across multiple sources. A boy Mandinka born near the Gambia River, raised in a mixed Islamic and traditional culture, expected to grow into a man with standing in his community. By the time Kunta Kinte was born, the Atlantic slave trade had been operating for more than 2 centuries. Portuguese traders had begun purchasing enslaved Africans in the 1400s. Other European powers followed. By the mid-1700s, the trade had become systematized, almost industrial. Ships departed from European ports with manufactured goods, guns, textiles, metal bars, alcohol. They sailed to West Africa and exchanged those goods for human beings. They crossed the Atlantic and sold their cargo in the Americas. They returned to Europe with sugar, tobacco, and cotton. This triangular trade was not a side business. It was central to the development of capitalism in the Atlantic world. The Gambia River was one of many African waterways folded into this machine. British, French, and Portuguese traders established outposts along its banks. They built fortifications. They raised their flags over stone forts and wooden palisades. They negotiated with African intermediaries, who captured people from the interior and brought them to the coast. Europeans rarely conducted raids themselves. African traders and political leaders participated in the system. They raided villages. They took prisoners during wars. They sold people who had been condemned by local legal systems. This African participation does not diminish European responsibility. It does not make the system less evil, but it complicates any simple story of European perpetrators and African victims. Some African leaders grew wealthy through the trade. Others resisted it, sometimes violently. Some communities were destroyed. Others adapted and survived. There was no single African experience. Kunta Kinte was captured within this system. The exact circumstances are uncertain. Haley's Roots describes him being taken while cutting wood near his village. We can imagine the scene. A teenager walking a familiar path, perhaps reciting a prayer, perhaps thinking about his future, ambushed by men he recognizes, or perhaps by strangers, knocked to the ground, bound before he can shout. That scene may be accurate. It may also be a narrative construction designed to emphasize innocence. The documents do not tell us. The archive does not care about the moment of capture. What we know is this. A teenage boy was seized and sold to European traders. He was transported to the coast. He was held in a facility while awaiting shipment, likely a stockade or holding pen near a fort. He was loaded onto a vessel bound for North America. The ship was likely a British slaver operating out of Liverpool or Bristol, one of many designed specifically for the transport of human cargo, floating instruments of industrial-scale kidnapping. The Middle Passage was the term used to describe the Atlantic crossing. The phrase itself sanitizes the experience. It makes violence sound like geography. The journey from the Gambia River to Maryland took about 2 months under favorable conditions. Storms could lengthen the voyage. Calms could trap ships at sea. Disease could kill passengers and crew alike. Below decks, enslaved Africans were held in spaces built for maximum capacity, not human comfort. They were chained in rows, packed shoulder to shoulder. They were allowed on deck in groups for brief periods. They were fed minimal rations calculated to keep them alive and sellable, nothing more. The air below deck was thick with heat, sweat, vomit, and waste. The ceiling was often no more than 4 or 5 feet high. People lay in their own filth for hours, sometimes days. Cries of pain blended with prayers and songs in languages the crew did not understand and did not care to learn. Death rates varied. Some voyagers lost 5% of their human cargo, others lost 30% or more. Captains calculated these losses into their business models. The dead were an accepted cost of doing business. They were sometimes thrown overboard at night, their absence marked only as a number in a logbook. In the records that survive from Maryland plantations, one detail stands out. The young Mandinka man, later identified as Kunta Kinte, was noted as having attempted escape 4 times during the crossing. The first attempt may have occurred while the ship still lay on the African coast, perhaps during the transfer from shore to ship. The second and third during the voyage itself, maybe rushing the deck in a moment of inattention, maybe trying to slip a shackle. The fourth upon arrival in Annapolis, seeing land and making one last desperate attempt before being fully processed into the system. Each attempt failed. Each was punished. The documentation does not describe the punishments in detail. It didn't need to. Everyone involved knew the standard practices. Whipping was routine. Branding was common. Confinement in spaces even smaller and darker than the main hold was used to break spirits. Sometimes captives were forced to watch others punished as a warning. These were not considered exceptional cruelties. They were normal methods of control. The ship arrived in Annapolis in the spring of 1767. The Chesapeake Bay was a major entry point for enslaved Africans bound for Maryland and Virginia. The harbor could accommodate large vessels. The infrastructure for human sails was well established: wharves, warehouses, courtyards where people would be displayed and examined. New arrivals were processed through a basic quarantine system. They were examined for obvious disease. Those showing symptoms were isolated. Those deemed healthy were prepared for sale. Prepared meant being minimally fed to improve appearance, forced to exercise on deck so they would look strong, oiled on the skin to create a sheen of health. Smiles and lively movement were encouraged and sometimes forced. It was an elaborate deception, designed to maximize price. The auction took place that summer. We can imagine the scene because similar auctions were described again and again. A tavern yard or public square, white buyers standing in clusters, an auctioneer on a platform, men, women and children brought out in groups, told to walk, to jump, to show their teeth. Questions shouted, how old? Has he been sick? Is he handy with tools? Laughter, bargaining, insults. The auctioneer described one young Mandinka male as rebellious, strong but difficult. That word rebellious lowered his price. It warned potential buyers that this man might run. In Annapolis, that was not necessarily a deal breaker. Planters in Maryland and Virginia were accustomed to purchasing Africans who resisted. They believed they could break a man's will with enough discipline, enough pain, enough strategic terror. They had methods. A man named John Waller purchased him. The transaction went into the city's ledgers. Date, description, price, buyer. The price was not exceptional. In the record, the young African was noted as strong but troublesome. Another piece of property acquired. What happened next would determine whether he survived. Most enslaved Africans brought into the Chesapeake did not survive more than 7 years under tobacco cultivation. Disease, overwork, accidents, and punishment took their toll. John Waller owned a medium-sized plantation in Spotsylvania County, Virginia. He cultivated tobacco. He owned roughly 30 enslaved people. He was not a great planter. He was not among the colonial elite. He was a middling farmer who relied on enslaved labor to maintain his economic position, typical for the region. Popular imagination often pictures slavery as vast cotton plantations, with hundreds of enslaved workers. That image comes from the 19th century Deep South. In the mid-18th century tobacco regions, operations were smaller and more dispersed. But smaller did not mean less brutal. The logic of slavery was the same regardless of scale. Human beings were property. Their labor was extracted through violence, or the threat of it. Their lives were controlled by owners who faced few legal constraints. A man who owned 30 enslaved people had in his own mind 30 tools for profit and 30 potential threats to manage. Kunta Kinte arrived at Waller's plantation sometime in the summer of 1767. He spoke no English. He knew only Mandinka and possibly some Arabic. That language barrier made him more isolated, made instruction harder, and made resistance more dangerous to plan. He was assigned to field work. Young African men without specialized skills were almost always sent to the fields. Tobacco required constant attention. Seeds planted in beds, seedlings transplanted to prepared hills, plants topped and suckered to force leaf growth, leaves harvested by hand, carried to barns, hung to cure, then stripped and packed. The work was year-round. During planting and harvest, the workday stretched from dawn to dark. In slower seasons, there was still fencing, repairs, wood-cutting, animal care. Enslaved people were never meant to be idle. Within the first month, according to plantation records, the new Mandinka field hand attempted to escape. He did not know the geography. He did not know the language. He had no map and no allies outside the plantation. But he tried. He was caught. He was punished. The punishment was recorded because it affected his ability to work. Several weeks later, he tried again. He was caught again. The punishment was more severe. This too went into Waller's careful records. Under Virginia law, slaveholders were expected to maintain documentation of major transactions, births and deaths, and punishments that resulted in permanent injury. These rules existed not to protect enslaved people, but to protect property values. A man who damaged his own property through excessive punishment was considered a bad manager. After the second escape attempt, Kunta was placed under closer supervision. He worked alongside more experienced enslaved people who were expected to watch him. He was housed where escape would be more difficult. The plantation adjusted its routines to contain his resistance, but he attempted a third escape. This time he made it farther. He was gone for several days before a patrol found him in the woods north of the plantation. Perhaps he had followed a stream. Perhaps he had hidden by day and moved at night. Perhaps he was already hungry and exhausted when the dogs found him. They brought him back. In the Waller family records, the punishment that followed is described in more detail. It was severe enough to require an explanation in the ledgers. Imagine being so determined to be free that you run away 3 times, knowing exactly what will happen if you're caught. On John Waller's tobacco plantation, the third escape didn't just earn another whipping. It triggered a punishment that was common enough to be mentioned in correspondence between slaveholders, but brutal enough that many did not survive it. They didn't just chain Kunta Kinte, they altered his body to make sure he would never run again. According to the records, Kunta's right foot was partially amputated after that third escape attempt. The procedure was carried out by the plantation overseer, not a trained physician. No anesthetic, no pain relief, no sterile instruments. Pain was part of the point. It was meant to punish and to frighten. This was a known practice in the colonial Chesapeake, not universal, but not rare. Enslaved people who repeatedly attempted to escape could be subjected to physical mutilation, designed to destroy their ability to run while preserving their ability to work. Typically, part of the front of the foot was removed. Enough remained to stand and walk, not enough remained to sprint into the woods. Within the internal logic of slavery, this made sense. A slave who ran represented a loss of labor and the risk of total loss of investment. Amputation was a one-time cost that eliminated future escapes while keeping the property useful. It was not seen as cruelty, it was seen as management. Virginia law defined enslaved Africans as property, not persons. That was not a metaphor, it was a legal category. Property could be bought, sold, mortgaged, and inherited. It could be damaged or destroyed at the owner's discretion, with only minimal limits. An owner was not supposed to kill a slave without cause, but cause was broadly defined. Punishment for resistance, including violent punishment, fell under acceptable use of property. As long as Kunta could still work, the law had nothing to say about what had been done to his foot. He survived the procedure. Many did not. Infection was common, gangrene was common, medical care was minimal, and usually provided only when it protected the owner's investment. Somehow Kunta lived. The wound eventually healed. Scar tissue formed. He learned to walk with a limp. He returned to work, now moving more slowly, with each step a reminder of both his defiance and the price extracted for it. After the amputation, there is no record of further escape attempts. His world shrank. Whatever hope he had of running to freedom died on that day. He had to find a way to live within the confines of the plantation. What did that life look like? The Waller plantation operated according to the standard practices of Chesapeake tobacco cultivation. Work was organized into gangs or tasks, depending on the season. Enslaved people were divided into groups based on age, sex, and perceived ability. There were drivers who enforced discipline under the overseer's eye. There were house slaves who worked in closer proximity to the white family, and field hands who labored from sunup to sundown. Young children did light tasks, carrying water, shooing birds from fields, picking worms off tobacco leaves. Older children worked in the fields or in domestic service. Adults worked at full capacity. The elderly worked until they simply could not stand in the rows any longer. The day began before dawn. The overseer, or a designated driver, woke the enslaved people. They assembled in the yard, received assignments, and walked out to the fields. During planting and harvest, they worked until dark. In other seasons they might return in mid-afternoon, only to face evening tasks: tending gardens, feeding animals, mending clothes, chopping wood, repairing tools. Rations were minimal. Cornmeal was the staple, sometimes salt pork, sometimes fish. Quantities were calculated to maintain working capacity, not to satisfy hunger. Many enslaved people kept small garden plots where they grew vegetables or raised chickens. They fished and hunted when they could. These efforts took place after the official workday ended, or on Sundays, the only day when field work was often reduced. Clothing was issued twice a year. Simple, rough garments, often ill-fitting. Shoes were scarce. Children often went barefoot year-round. Adults wore their shoes until they fell apart, often wrapping their feet in cloth when leather gave out. Housing consisted of simple wooden cabins, 1 or 2 rooms, dirt floors, minimal furniture. Several people might share a single space. Sleeping arrangements were cramped. Smoke from cooking fires clung to rough interior walls. Privacy was almost non-existent. These material conditions were not the result of neglect. They were deliberate. The system was designed to extract maximum labor at minimum cost, and to prevent enslaved people from accumulating resources that might enable escape or rebellion. Dependence was policy. Within this world, Kunta Kinte lived for decades. He worked the tobacco fields, now more slowly but still relentlessly. He slept in the cabins. He ate the rations. He wore the rough clothes. His body adapted to the constant labor and the permanent pain in his mutilated foot, the ache that flared in cold weather and rainy seasons. But adaptation is not the same as acceptance. Across the plantation, resistance took many forms: work slowdowns, accidental tool breakage, feigned illness, sabotage of equipment, small thefts of food, covert teaching of letters and numbers despite legal bans, acts small enough to escape severe punishment, but persistent enough to assert that enslaved people were not simply machines. Kunta's early escape attempts were one form of overt resistance. After amputation made running impossible, did he find subtler ways to resist? The records do not say. They rarely do. We can only infer from patterns seen elsewhere that someone like him, with a demonstrated will to resist, would not silently accept his fate in every small decision. Some of the limited space for resilience came through culture and religion. The religion of enslaved people in Virginia was complex. Some converted to Christianity. Some maintained African religious practices. Many blended the two. Missionaries preached obedience and submission, insisting that slavery was part of God's plan, and that suffering in this life would be repaid in the next. Some enslaved people accepted that message. Others turned it upside down, finding in Christian stories of deliverance and justice a promise that their oppression was wrong and would one day be overturned. Still others clung to African traditions, or wove them quietly into Christian forms. Prayer meetings, baptisms, funerals. These gatherings created moments where enslaved people could speak, sing, and remember with less direct white supervision. They were spaces of cultural survival, and sometimes of planning and solidarity. Kunta had been raised Muslim in Gambia, in a form of Islam that was already blended with local traditions. Did he maintain those practices in Virginia? There is no documentation. We know that some enslaved Muslims in North America continued to pray and fast in secret, turning toward an unseen Mecca in the dark of a cabin. Others could not. Over time, many Islamic practices were lost or transformed. What is likely is that Kunta found himself in a religious landscape where his own traditions were marginalized, but not entirely erased. One more part of his identity he had to fight to preserve in memory, if not in public ritual. Language and music also became tools of survival. Enslaved Africans in the Chesapeake spoke dozens of languages: Mandinka, Wolof, Igbo, Yoruba, Kikongo, and more. They needed to communicate with each other, and with English-speaking overseers. Creole languages and distinctive dialects developed, mixing African grammar and rhythms with English vocabulary. Work songs coordinated labor and preserved African musical patterns. Spirituals combined Christian themes with African forms. Call and response patterns, polyrhythms, and melismatic singing carried across the rows. None of this was simple replication. It was new culture created under pressure. Kunta Kinte was part of this process. He was one of millions forced to navigate between their cultures of origin and the brutal world of American slavery, trying to maintain a sense of self while adapting enough to stay alive. Within that world, he formed a relationship with a woman named Belle. Belle was likely born in Virginia. She served as the plantation cook. That role gave her slightly better material conditions than field workers, more consistent access to food, indoor work, and a bit more control over her routine. The kitchen, unpleasant and hot as it was, could be a space of relative autonomy, compared to the open fields under an overseer's direct eye. The relationship between Kunta and Belle is described in Roots as a slow courtship. He is portrayed as suspicious of an American-born woman at first. She is wary of an African man, who refuses to accept the slave named Toby. Over time they grow to trust each other. That may be true, it may be romantic embellishment. What the records do show is that they had a daughter named Kizzy, around 1770. The birth of a child to enslaved parents was always double-edged. A new life, yes, but also new property. Under Virginia law, children inherited the status of the mother. A child born to an enslaved woman was enslaved from birth. Her body, her labor, her future children, all belonged in law to the owner. Kunta would have understood this. He would have known that his daughter had no legal rights, that she could be sold at any time, that he could not protect her from the market. Every smile, every touch, carried that knowledge in its shadow. Love did not stop under slavery, but it lived under constant threat. Every bond could be broken by sale. Every joy carried the shadow of loss. Kizzy grew up on the Waller plantation. She learned domestic skills. She likely helped Belle in the kitchen, carrying water, preparing food, tending fires. Some accounts suggest she may have learned to read, a dangerous, illegal act under Virginia's slave codes. The evidence is thin, but not implausible. Enslaved people sometimes did learn to read in secret, through sympathetic whites, other blacks, or by piecing together letters from cast-off newspapers and Bibles. What we know for certain is that when Kizzy was about 16, she was sold. The sale appears in Waller's ledgers. The buyer was a man named Tom Layer, a North Carolina slaveholder. To Waller the transaction was routine. A young enslaved woman, now of prime working and reproductive age, converted into cash. No special justification required. No legal restriction on separating her from her parents. For Kunta and Belle, the sale was catastrophic. Their daughter was taken away. They did not know where. They did not know if they would ever see her again. There is no record they did. This was how the domestic slave trade functioned. After the United States banned the external slave trade in 1808, an enormous internal trade developed. Enslaved people were bought and sold within the country, often moved from the Upper South to the Deep South. Tens of thousands of families were torn apart. Letters and ledgers between slaveholders discussed these sales purely in economic terms. Price, health, productivity. The destruction of families barely registers in the documents. Slave narratives written in the 19th century describe the human side, the terror of the auction block, the humiliation of inspection, the agony of separation, adults clinging to children until they were forced apart, husbands and wives embracing for the last time under a whip's threat. Reunion was rare, distances were large, movement by enslaved people was tightly controlled. Resources to search for family were non-existent. After Kizzy's sale, Kunta and Belle continued to live and work on the Waller plantation. They continued to survive. They had no other choice. Oral tradition collected by Alex Haley suggests that Kunta withdrew further into himself after losing his daughter. He spoke less. He held on to his rituals in whatever way he could. Perhaps he told fewer stories in the quarters. Perhaps he prayed more quietly. Perhaps he carried his grief in his posture, in the way he looked at the road leading away from the plantation. This is plausible, but not verifiable. The written record is silent about his inner life. What we do know is that he lived many more years. His body, already scarred by iron and mutilation, wore down under decades of labor. The amputated foot likely caused chronic pain that worsened with age. Arthritis would have set in. Exposure, poor diet, and minimal medical care would have produced a host of ailments. Respiratory problems, infections, chronic fatigue. Plantation records show only occasional expenditures for doctors to treat enslaved people. Medical attention was a cost weighed against the potential return of restored labor. Minor illnesses were ignored. Enslaved people relied on traditional remedies, African, Native American, and European folk practices, and on each other. Older enslaved people presented an economic problem for slaveholders. They could not work as hard, they required more care, they consumed resources without producing as much profit. Some were sold to traders, who specialized in squeezing whatever labor they could from elderly or disabled people in harsher conditions. Others were kept on, doing lighter work or caring for children, passing on knowledge about plants, stories, and survival strategies. Kunta appears to have remained on the Walla plantation until his death. Probably it was simpler and cheaper to leave him where he was. The exact date of his death is unknown. At some point he simply vanishes from the records. He was likely buried in an unmarked grave on or near the plantation, in a segregated burial ground for enslaved people. The location is lost under later development, erosion, or neglect. His death changed nothing in the operation of the plantation. Tobacco was planted the next year. New enslaved children were born. Others were sold. The system continued. So how do we know anything about him at all? We know because his descendants remembered his name. Kizzy, wherever she ended up in North Carolina, told her children about her father, an African man who had refused to accept the name Toby, who had been taken from his homeland, who had tried to escape again and again, who had his foot partially cut off as punishment, who held on to his African identity and his stories. Her children told their children. The story passed down generation to generation, across slavery, through the Civil War, through Reconstruction, through Jim Crow. By the 20th century, those descendants preserved fragments of a story, a man called Kunta Kinte, taken from a village called Juffure, enslaved in America, punished for running, determined not to forget his name. In the 1960s, a writer named Alex Haley began to collect those stories. He interviewed older relatives. He listened to how details shifted from one teller to another. He followed the thread of names and places. He traveled to Gambia. He spoke with local historians and griots, traditional storytellers, who kept lineages and village histories in their heads. He searched archives in Maryland and Virginia. He found records of a slave ship arriving in Annapolis from the Gambia River in 1767. He found the name of John Waller in Spotsylvania County. He found entries about a young Mandinka male purchased in Annapolis, about escape attempts, about punishment severe enough to warrant note. From those fragments, and from his family's oral tradition, he constructed a narrative. In 1976, he published it as Roots, the Saga of an American Family. Roots became a cultural phenomenon. The book was a bestseller. The television miniseries, which aired in 1977, reached more than 100 million American viewers. For many, it was the first time slavery appeared, not as an abstract institution, but as a story of specific people with names, faces, families, and pain. People named their children Kunta and Kizzy. Genealogy societies saw surges of interest. Classroom discussions changed. For a moment, an enslaved African man's story sat at the center of American popular culture. But Roots was not pure history. Haley himself called it faction, a blend of fact and fiction. He filled gaps in the record with dialogue, scenes, and inner thoughts that could not be documented. He presented some speculative links as if they were proven. Genealogists and historians quickly raised questions. Some of his documentary evidence was ambiguous. Some connections between African villages and American families were difficult to verify. Another author sued Haley for plagiarism, claiming parts of Roots were lifted from his novel. The case was settled out of court. Haley acknowledged some similarities, but insisted they were unintentional. The controversy obscured an important point. There was almost certainly a real man very much like the Kunta Kinte of Roots. Independent of Haley's work, plantation and port records confirm. A ship from the Gambia River region, arriving in Annapolis in 1767, a young Mandinka male sold to John Waller of Spotsylvania County, multiple escape attempts by that enslaved man, a punishment involving partial amputation of a foot. The question is not whether such a man existed. The question is how much of his specific story we can truly know. Here we run into the central problem of writing the history of enslaved people. The archive of slavery is an archive of slaveholders. It contains bills of sale, plantation ledgers, legal documents, letters between owners, shipping manifests, court cases. It records transactions, prices, punishments, and profits. It rarely records feelings. Enslaved people's voices appear only indirectly, in runaway advertisements that describe their scars and mannerisms, in court records, when their testimony was occasionally admitted, in brief mentions in letters, in notations of troublesome or rebellious. For the most part, the people who lived the experience of slavery did not control the pen. They were legally forbidden to learn to read and write. Their testimony carried little or no legal weight. Their inner lives had no value to the system, so the system did not record them. What we know about the interior lives of enslaved people comes mostly from sources created after emancipations, slave narratives written in the 19th century, interviews with formerly enslaved people conducted in the 20th, oral histories within families and communities. These sources are invaluable, but they are also shaped by memory, by time, by the conditions under which people told their stories. They are not simple windows into the past. Kunta Kinte exists in the space where oral tradition, fragmentary documents, and historical imagination intersect. We know enough to say, a young Mandinka man was taken from the Gambia River region. He arrived in Annapolis in 1767. He was sold to John Waller. He attempted to escape multiple times. He was punished with partial amputation of his right foot. He lived on the plantation for decades. He had at least one child who was sold away. Everything beyond that lies on a spectrum between probability and invention. Does this uncertainty make his story less important? No, it makes it more honest. It forces us to admit what slavery did not just to bodies, but to memory. It reminds us that erasure was part of the system. It demands that we be careful when we fill in the blanks. Roots did something extraordinary. It made millions of people care about an enslaved man's life as more than a statistic. It helped African Americans see that their ancestry did not begin in chains, but in African villages with languages, religions, and cultures of their own. It forced many white Americans to confront slavery as a human crime, not just a political issue. At the same time, Roots turned a particular life into a universal symbol. It invited people to see the African ancestor in a single figure. Symbols are powerful, but they can flatten complexity. They can make it easy to forget all the unnamed millions, whose stories left no trace at all. Kunta Kinte as a cultural figure represents African resistance to enslavement, the maintenance of identity under pressure, the refusal to accept a slave name. The historical Kunta Kinte, as far as we can reconstruct him, was one enslaved man among millions, whose experience was in many ways typical: capture, forced voyage, sale, brutal punishment, family shattered by sale, death without record. Both versions matter. One reminds us that slavery was built on the destruction of countless individual lives. The other gives us a focal point for memory, a way to talk about those lives in public. When we remember Kunta Kinte standing on that auction block in Annapolis in 1767, we should see both. One young man, 16 years old, physically strong despite trauma, marked as rebellious, and also one of approximately 12 million Africans transported across the Atlantic, one of perhaps 10 million who survived the crossing, one of millions forced to work, to suffer, to watch families torn apart. The Middle Passage destroyed more than bodies. It destroyed languages. It shattered cultures. It cut off lines of knowledge, art, and thought that would never be developed because the people who would have created them were enslaved or killed. Yet even within that destruction, people created new culture. They blended African and European elements into something distinctively African American. They invented new music, new religious forms, new ways of speaking, new family structures adapted to a world where families could be broken at any time. Kunta's reported insistence on his African name, refusing Toby, holding on to Kunta Kinte, is part of that cultural resistance. Whether every detail of that story is literally accurate matters less than the pattern it represents. Enslaved people often kept African names and used them among themselves, even as they answered to imposed names in front of whites. That quiet dual identity was one way of preserving a self the system could not fully own. The economic legacy of slavery is still with us. The labor of people like Kunta Kinte created enormous wealth, That wealth funded banks, insurance companies, universities, and families who passed it down through generations. The people whose labor built that wealth received nothing. When slavery ended legally, formerly enslaved people started with no accumulated assets in a society that continued to discriminate against them through Jim Crow laws, exclusion from New Deal programs, redlining, and other forms of systemic racism. Today's racial wealth gap is not an accident, it is the compounded result of centuries of extraction and exclusion. At the same time, the memory of slavery remains contested. How should it be taught? What should be commemorated? For many years, plantation tours focused on architecture and gardens, barely mentioning the enslaved people who made them possible. Monuments celebrated Confederate generals, while the enslaved remained largely invisible in public spaces. In that landscape, stories like Kunta Kinte's, especially as popularized by Roots, have played a complicated role. They brought the experience of slavery into millions of living rooms. They made it impossible to ignore, but they also risked letting one family's saga stand in for the entire system, making it easier to package a story of suffering and eventual survival without always confronting the unrelenting structural nature of slavery and its long aftermath. The archive of slavery is vast, and still, in crucial ways, incomplete. Millions of documents preserve the perspective of owners. Very few preserve the perspectives of the owned. Historians have learned to read these documents against the grain, looking for hints of enslaved lives in notations about punishments, runaway advertisements, household inventories. Archaeology, oral history, and comparative analysis help fill some gaps. But there will always be things we cannot know. We cannot know exactly what Kunta thought as he stood on the auction block. We cannot know the words he may have used when he told his daughter about Africa. We cannot know what stories he whispered to himself while lying awake in a slave cabin, with his mutilated foot throbbing in the dark. We can guess, we can imagine, but we must be honest, that imagination is not the same as evidence. We can know that he existed, that he suffered, that he resisted, that he loved, that he lost. We can know that his name traveled across centuries in the mouths of his descendants. We can know that when Alex Haley went looking for the African origin of his family, he found in Kunta Kinte a figure who carried not just one family's story, but something of the story of millions. The story of Kunta Kinte is ultimately a story about what it means to be human under extreme oppression. How do people maintain dignity when systems are designed to strip it away? How do they preserve identity when authorities seek to erase it? How do they resist when resistance seems futile? Kunta's resistance did not succeed in the way heroic stories usually define success. He did not escape. He did not overthrow the system. He was punished and broken physically. He lost his freedom, his homeland, his daughter, everything. But he kept something: his name, his memory of Africa, his sense that he was more than property. He passed that sense somehow to his daughter. She passed it to her children. They passed it down until someone wrote it down and turned it into a book and a film series that changed how millions thought about slavery. That is not victory, but it is endurance. It is survival of a different kind. We return, finally, to the auction block in Annapolis. In 1767, a young man stands in chains. He does not know that his foot will be partially cut off years from now. He does not know that his daughter will be sold away. He does not know that his name will cross centuries. He knows only that he has been taken from his home, that he is surrounded by people who do not speak his language, that he is being examined like livestock. We can imagine what he might have felt. We can project our own emotions into that scene. But we are not him. We did not live his life. History at its best teaches us humility. We can know facts. We can trace patterns. We can expose systems. We can honor lives that the documents tried to reduce to lines in a ledger. But we cannot fully enter the minds of those who lived and died in bondage. Kunta Kinte, born in Africa, died in America, enslaved but not erased. His story matters not because it is unique, but because it is particular, not because we know everything about it, but because what we do know reveals the nature of a system that tried to turn people into things and failed in crucial ways to do so. His story is a thread we can trace from a small village on the Gambia River, to the belly of a slave ship, to an auction block in Maryland, to a tobacco field in Virginia, to an unmarked grave, to the memories of his descendants, to a book and a miniseries, and now to you. What you do with that thread, whether you drop it, or follow it into the larger tapestry of slavery and its ongoing legacy, that is another story.